Welcome. There's a lot of really familiar faces here. There's also a lot that I haven't seen before, which I always think is a great sign. And I just want to, make sure that you feel welcome in coming to this talk. And I'm very excited about it too. I especially want to thank you for coming to this talk today, especially at this time of the year when we are all insanely busy with the end of the semester. And of course, when the lovely weather is just, so much. We've all been waiting for this, and we just want to be outside. So I want to thank you for coming to this presentation today. And I can assure you it will be worth it because we've gathered here today for the 2019 Linda and Charles Wilson Humanities and Medicine Annual Lecture, which also just so happens to be, I got very smart this time and made this be the last event in the Women's Studies Colloquium for the spring 2019 semester. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rose Holtz. In addition to serving as the Associate Director of the Women's and Gender Studies Program, I am also privileged to serve as the Director of the Humanities and Medicine Program. Before I introduce Professor Freidenfelds, I want to say some words of thanks to people and, of course, share some good news about things that are on the horizon. And first, I want to thank our co-sponsors, and that would be, of course, Women's and Gender Studies, also the Communication Studies Department. And I want to say how lovely it is that we are now on the same floor together in Pound Hall, and I look forward to all sorts of wonderful collaborations in the future. Then I, of course, want to take a moment to acknowledge Dr. Chuck Wilson and his wife, Linda. Dr. Wilson is there in front and center. The reason being is that because without their vision and their financial support, the Humanities and Medicine program here at UNL simply would not exist. Dr. Wilson is a UNL alum. He graduated with a degree in English, and then he went on to do the unthinkable and became a successful cardiologist. And so Dr. Wilson is a Renaissance man of sorts, and he believes that others should be given the opportunity to become Renaissance people in their own right. And indeed, when he retired from his distinguished career in medicine, he decided he wanted to make sure other aspiring practitioners had the opportunity to combine their interest in healthcare in all of its varieties with their love of the humanities, which, as we all know, is essential to becoming good medical practitioners. And just a few words about the program. It was created in 1996. It's been on the cutting edge of a movement that has taken off in recent years at colleges and universities across the nation. But UNL, due to Dr. Wilson's commitment to and passion for the medical humanities, has been at the leading edge of this trend, and the program has grown tremendously. We have roughly 120 students who are pursuing the minor, and Dr. Wilson and his wife have generously provided scholarships for this. Over the years, we've invited all sorts of great speakers to come and deliver our annual address, and these have included Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens, more on her in a moment, Susan Reverby, Lee Gutkind, Mark Vonnegut, Susan Lawrence, Nancy Toms, to name just a few. And so, Lara, you are indeed in good company as a historian of medicine and visiting the University of Nebraska. So again, thank you, Dr. Wilson and Linda, and of course, I want to thank you on behalf of the students as well. Third, and with regard to Dr. Wilson and HMed, if you don't know this already, I want to remind you of the good news that we have in securing a new director for the Humanities and Medicine program. Her name is Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens. Again, this is the result of Dr. Wilson's vision and generosity, for he also created an endowed professorship precisely to lead the HMed program into the future, and I'm delighted that we have found such an amazing scholar to take on this role. As you may recall, Professor Owens served as the speaker for HMed's annual lecture last year. She's a brilliant historian who combines the history of medicine, women, and race in phenomenal ways. She's the author of a really great book called Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology. She's also the 2018 recipient of the prestigious OAH Darlene Kleck-Hein Award. And she's going to be coming to UNL this summer, this August, thereabouts, and she'll be a faculty member in the Department of History. And so I want to point out what a big deal this is, because Professor Owens will be one of only 2 African-American women in the United States to lead a medical humanities program. So this is a big deal. And so once again, Dr. Wilson, you and Linda are on the cutting edge of things, so thank you again. And I hope that you all join me in welcoming Professor Owens when she comes to UNL this summer. So, Having said all that, I want to introduce our speaker, my colleague and my friend, Professor Lara Freidenfelds, who will be speaking on Perfect Pregnancies and Mourned Miscarriages, A History of Modern Childbearing. And some of this bio may sound familiar to you. It was on the publicity materials. Freidenfelds is a historian of sex, reproduction, and women's health in America, and the author of The Modern Period, Menstruation in the 20th Century. She blogs with a historian's perspective on childbearing, parenting, sex, and health. She holds a PhD in the history of science from Harvard. Her research has also been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Mellon Foundation, and she is also the mom of 2 children. I want to add, too, what a treat it is that you have in coming to this talk, because you're getting a sneak peek at her new book, which is coming out in early 2020. It's called The Myth of the Perfect Pregnancy, A History of Miscarriage in America. And so I encourage you to keep your eye out for that. And there is a sign-up sheet by that door over there if you want to get information about it, and also just follow her blog and her newsletter. If you put your email up there, then you can do that. But I want to just share one quick story, and it has to do with how we met, and it gives you a little personal window into things. You may or may not know this, but the world of historians of women, medicine, and sexuality are a small and weird bunch. And with knowledge and interest in things that most normal people don't even consider thinking about. And so one day, several years ago, I got an email from one of these scholars, another good friend, Sarah Rodriguez. And I could tell she had written the email. Of course, I could see that she had written the email very late at night, but it was also just the way she had written the email. Because I could hear kind of this groggy, bleary-eyed voice, very tired voice. And she wanted to tell me, before she forgot the details of the conversation, it was a conversation she had with somebody whom she had only just met, that being Lara. And she said something to the effect of, we were talking really late into the night about reproduction, the body, in utero development, embryos and fetuses. And she's like, I wasn't sure what Lara was all talking about, but it got me thinking about you. And I believe then Sarah, I can't remember how that's worked out, but she may have included us both in the emails or whatever, and one of us followed up right away, and boom. We were right there on the same page, thinking about all the same things. So Sarah really nailed it. And I just want to say how wonderful that is, because we have these thoughts floating around our head, and you go, am I crazy thinking about these things? And then to find somebody else who is also thinking about them is just really wonderful. So I'm looking forward to you all hearing what she all has to say. And with no further ado, I'm going to give you Professor Lara Freidenfelds.
Hi. Thank you very much to Professor Holz for inviting me today, and to Dr. and Mrs. Wilson for supporting this wonderful program. This is really great, and the medical humanities are so important to future doctors and also to all of us who are future patients and future parents, people who need to know about medicine and bodies and life and death in ways that are really profound and thoughtful. And I will put in one more plug. Definitely take Professor Owen's classes. She's so interesting, smart, amazing scholar. I'm so excited for you that you recruited her here. Today in America, when a couple plans for a child, every moment can seem precious and unique. And the pleasures and responsibilities of parenthood are commonly assumed to start from conception. It can seem like if we plan carefully enough, try hard enough, and love ardently enough, we ought to be able to have perfect pregnancies. And to give you a sense of what this looks like right now, when a woman becomes pregnant and a couple becomes pregnant, I want to show you a little bit from a pregnancy app. And this is the latest iteration of many generations of guides and advice for pregnant women. To show you this, I pretended I was pregnant and downloaded the Glow Nurture app. Now on this, you can see that the Glow Nurture app, which is one of the most popular apps, promises that you will be able to watch your baby grow, you will stay informed and in control, and that you can share your thoughts and your questions with a 10 million plus strong community. The app, when I downloaded it, asked me, do you know your due date? And I decided to tell it no. So it asked me, on what day did your last period begin? And I gave it a date that was a month and 2 days previously. So as if I had taken a home pregnancy test the minute I was a couple days late and thought this might be it. It told me I was at 4 weeks and 3 days. I had 248 days to go. Your baby is the size of a tomato seed. There's a little image there, and if I click on it, I could see more. It invited me to complete a log in which I would, as it says, track your health, symptoms, moods, your prenatal care. It would ask me detailed questions about what I ate and drank and how much I slept and whether I smoked cigarettes or had any alcohol, as well as whether I was depressed or moody or happy or excited, many other questions. It offered what it calls insights, which are little articles about how to take care of myself, and some of which are based directly on the things you've told it in your log. And at the bottom, it offered a few more things that I can do. I can interact with the community. I can create a time lapse, which I'll show you in a moment. It invited me to fill out my baby profile. So it filled in the due date. I'm pregnant with, and I told it, as far as I knew, one baby. It invited me to put in the baby's nickname, and then the sex, if I knew it, which I couldn't know yet at this stage. And it said, do you want to create a time lapse? And the time lapse is where you take pregnant belly selfies. It invites you, shows you should start them at 4 weeks, and you take them once a week so that you get this neat looking, I'm going to show you some samples from it, week 10, week 25, week 39. You get this really cool time lapse souvenir at the end of your pregnancy to remember it. Now, after downloading this app, I might think, well, okay, I've got the app. Now I want to check out some of the good websites. So I might go to babycenter.com. Now, this is the behemoth of websites. It's the biggest pregnancy and baby care website. It's kind of one of the big mainstream websites. And if you tell this website that you're about 4 weeks pregnant, it will tell you your baby is the size of a poppy seed. It'll offer you cool videos you can watch to learn, see what life in the womb is like for your baby now. It also will, on the sidebar, you can see, offer you a Babies R Us registry, so you can start buying things for your baby right now. And if you do sign up for the email newsletter, it'll right away send you this, again, more details about the size of your baby and what it looks like. And it will invite you to get started by finding the perfect name. Browse over 100,000 names in our baby names finder, save your favorites, and poll friends and family to help you decide. So if you have a perfect pregnancy, one that goes to term and ends with the birth of a healthy child, this can seem like a really lovely way to begin. But if you don't have a perfect pregnancy, if instead you have a miscarriage, this kind of introduction to pregnancy can result in a really devastating miscarriage experience. So, for example, this is Lori Garcia. She blogs as mommyfriend.com, and she's been blogging a very long time. So shortly after, I guess when her older son that you can see in that picture there, when he was just a couple years old, she and her husband decided that they would try for a second child. But it didn't go well. She lost her pregnancy at 9 weeks. And 9 weeks means actually 9 weeks after the last menstrual period, so that's about 7 weeks after conception. And she told her blog audience, my husband and I had a very poignant conversation last night about whether to try again. We both have tremendous fear about how I would handle a potential subsequent loss. I feel so scared of my body, scared of my feelings, and scared of the future when faced with this decision. I feel so foolish when I go back and read my second pregnancy journal because I am filled with so much hope and faith, blissfully unaware of what my pregnancy would bring. I'm having trouble finding that faith in the future again. I prayed for clarity last night above all things. And they did decide to try again, as you can see. And once they decided, Lori explained, we prayed for another baby. And so our terrifying journey of trying to conceive again begins. Lori almost didn't have this second child because she had such a devastating experience with an early pregnancy loss. Now, just as the app and the websites I showed you would have been nearly unimaginable just a few generations ago, as recently as the late 1970s, pregnancy guidebook author Elizabeth Whalen could comfortably assert that an early miscarriage is most often interpreted as a lost opportunity rather than a lost baby, and the couple is eager to start a new pregnancy as soon as possible. In this talk, I will describe the array of historical shifts that came together to give us our current way of understanding pregnancy and pregnancy loss. This historical change is important to understand for a couple of reasons. First, miscarriage is very common, and in fact, doctors consider it a normal part of healthy women's childbearing. This graph shows the frequency, the chance of miscarrying by week of pregnancy. So you'll see the first line here shows fertilization, and then the second line shows implantation at about 3 weeks. And then just a couple days after that, a home pregnancy test can measure human chorionic gonadotrophin in urine and can tell you at least that you have human chorionic gonadotrophin in your urine. It can't tell you yet whether you have a successful pregnancy. Because you can see so in week 2 to 3, we don't yet have a good way of measuring pregnancy. So this is a range of guesses that scientists have made for how often a fertilized egg that is not yet implanted actually miscarries. Once we hit 3 weeks or so and it's implanted, then we actually have a very good sense that about 30% of implanted fertilized eggs miscarry. And if we look before that, the estimates for how many pregnancies, how many fertilized eggs don't make it to become a full-term baby, it's upwards. It's close, at least close to 40%. And actually, most scientists who research this put the estimate more at the top end here of about 70%. And usually guidebooks will tell you about 20% of confirmed pregnancies miscarry. So if you assume that people confirm them around 5 or 6 weeks. And at that rate, about 1 in 3 American women who have 2 children, which is the most common size family, have also had a miscarriage. And second, knowing the history of modern childbearing can help us understand not only why we experience miscarriage the way we do, but also gives insight into everything from the challenges of infertility to the skyrocketing rate of cesarean section to the phenomenon of helicopter parenting. When we understand how we got to the childbearing culture we have today, we have a better chance of making intentional and thoughtful changes to it in the future. Now, the history I will share today focuses on middle-class Americans because they largely pioneered the historical changes I will discuss, and they have consistently had the resources to invest in new ways of handling pregnancy. But this modern culture of childbearing affects everyone. It sets the standards by which everyone is judged, and also promises benefits to which most Americans aspire to the degree that they have the resources to do so. Now, I talked about in the introduction there about a shift that we can see happening just in the last few generations. But to really understand this, we actually need to go back quite a bit further. So to understand how this modern childbearing culture came about, we actually need to start with a quick look at the traditional childbearing culture from which it emerged. In colonial America, married women had children every 2 or 3 years, and they had big families, and children came when they came. Couples mostly assumed that they would leave it up to God and fate. Lush fertility was celebrated. Children were valued as a source of labor and economic support in old age, as the fulfillment of the biblical encouragement to be fruitful and multiply, and as a continuation of the patriarchal family line. Childbearing gave women their central role in life and earned them social and spiritual respect, as well as a family to love. Women bore many children, but their survival was far from guaranteed. Nearly every family was touched by the death of an infant or a child, and often by more than one. Stillbirths occurred more than they do today, and miscarriages were very common. In this context, an early pregnancy loss hardly registered. Now, we don't have a lot of direct evidence about miscarriage because it was seldom recorded in writing. But we do have one really interesting example I can share with you here. Prominent Philadelphia Quaker Elizabeth Drinker's extensive diary gives us some sense. Her youngest child died as a toddler, and it left her heartbroken. She wrote movingly of her dear little baby and her dear little companion, who she deeply mourned. In contrast, she did record evidence of 2 miscarriages she has had, but her diary entries for those sounded more like this. There's one that she wrote, May 26, 1768, ED, that is Elizabeth Drinker, miscarried, and that was the entire entry. 2 fundamental cultural shifts began to take hold around the time of the American Revolution. These shifts in how Americans thought about human efficacy and human relationships would remake childbearing. They underlaid and gave shape to the social, political, medical, and technological innovations that now structure modern childbearing in America. First, there was the idea that people could and should control their fertility and plan their families. That was a radical idea at this time. In the Revolutionary era, Americans began to imagine not just political self-determination, but new kinds of self-determination in private life as well. We can see this, for instance, in a letter from Peggy Shippen Arnold. This is her, the wife of Benedict Arnold, to her sister. In that letter, she wrote, "It gives me great pleasure to hear of your prudent resolution of not increasing your family. I have determined upon the same plan, and when our sisters have had 5 or 6, we will likewise recommend it to them." Over the course of the 19th century, Americans followed Arnold's lead and reduced their childbearing from an average of 7 children in 1800 to between 3 and 4 children in 1900. You think about that. They did that before they had anything that we would consider effective birth control. They used douching and withdrawal and abstained. They used some of the things you see here. There's patent medicines like Baldwin's herbal female pills were advertised to remove obstructions arising from cold, and talking about catching a cold was something that people used as a euphemism for getting pregnant. And then on the right side here, you'll see actually a pretty straight up ad for abortion services. So people used all kinds of means to reduce their childbearing during the 19th century, to cut it in half, despite not having anything that we would expect to work reliably. So in this context, women welcomed early miscarriages as a natural method of child spacing. The 20th century saw the development of much more precise birth control, fueled by feminist determination and feminist funding. The birth control pill came on the market in 1957, officially to regulate the menstrual period, and then was approved as a method of birth control in 1960, and was rapidly taken up by American women. And then by 1995, it could seem reasonable for the Institutes of Medicine to recommend that the nation adopt a new social norm. All pregnancies should be intended. That is, they should be consciously and clearly desired at the time of conception. That may sound obvious to you today, but I can tell you that, my parents had their children in the 1970s, and this standard for how intentional pregnancies had to be struck them as kind of remarkably intense and high expectation of what planning meant. So at this point, our technological ability to prevent conception is almost perfect. But this has misled us into feeling like we have control over our fertility more broadly, when in fact we are not nearly as good at reliably getting and staying pregnant as we are at preventing pregnancy. Oops, I'm going to leave it there. Now, the second fundamental shift was in how Americans thought about the purpose of parenting. Like the change in ideas about controlling fertility, this shift began around the time of the Revolution and has accelerated ever since. And we can see this in the diary entries of women in the young republic. We see new articulations of the experience of childbearing as centrally the instantiation of a loving bond between mother and child. For example, Elizabeth Sedgwick, who is the proprietor of Mrs. Sedgwick's School for Young Ladies in Lenox, Massachusetts, described in her diary the birth of her first child. She said, "At 6 o'clock on the 7th of January, 1824, I was a mother and experienced that delightful transition from suffering, danger, and anxiety to happiness and that intense delight, that unspeakable sentiment which pervade the heart at its first maternal throb." As women had fewer children, remember I said they dropped their childbearing to just between 3 and 4 by the end of the century. Their idea about parenting became more focused on intensive parenting and sentiment. They could lavish more attention on each child, and mothering especially became more about intensive affectionate nurture of each child as an individual. In the mid-20th century, psychoanalysts such as John Bowlby here articulated a theory of maternal attachment, positing that a consistent, intensive, loving relationship between mother and child was critical to child development and mental health. In the 1970s, the concept of bonding brought the focus to the moment of birth, and parents were told that loving contact with their newborn in the hours after birth could make or break their relationship and their child's long-term prospects. The stakes of establishing a loving relationship never seemed so high. During the same time, traditional reasons for parenting faded away. By the mid-20th century, few American families relied on child labor, and in fact, children were more like an expense. Feminists challenged the centrality of childbearing to women's lives, and environmentalists, such as the zero population growth movement, argued that children were actually a burden on the planet. By the end of the 20th century, Americans largely believed that the only good reason to have children was to establish a rewardingly loving relationship with them. And beginning in the early 21st century, the idea of bonding moved earlier, before birth and into pregnancy. Parents were supposed to initiate a loving relationship with their child as early as possible, even, according to websites like Baby Center, during the first weeks of pregnancy, when, as I showed you, miscarriage is still quite high. So these two fundamental shifts in feeling I've described, the idea that couples could and should control their fertility and plan their pregnancies, and the idea that parenting is centrally about a loving bond between parent and child, underlay and informed a range of 20th century changes in childbearing culture, and I turn to these next. First, prenatal care, the idea that a woman should get preventive medical care and take special care of herself during pregnancy, was a new concept in the early 20th century. Before that, women pretty much took pregnancy for granted, and if they worried about anything, it was the birth itself. Early prenatal care reformers were optimistic, often unrealistically optimistic, about the ability of prenatal care to produce perfect pregnancies. For example, obstetric nurse Carolyn Conant Van Blarcom's 1922 popular pregnancy guide, Getting Ready to Be a Mother, told her readers, at least 1 out of every 5 pregnancies ends in abortion, and by that she meant miscarriage. That was the medical term for miscarriage. The tragedy of this is that it is very largely a preventable disaster. The prevention of miscarriages is of such obvious importance, and there is so much about it that you can do to this end, that we shall take up the question at some length. She told women not to use a foot treadle sewing machine, not to jump too much, not to run, not to dance. Really, all of her recommendations are things that we know today would not have helped. Now, Van Blarcom herself gave an overly optimistic picture in her popular guide. And we know this because when she spoke to her medical audience in her obstetric nursing textbook, published this same year, she acknowledged that a large portion of miscarriages were inevitable. She wrote, Dr. Mall of Johns Hopkins University showed, after years of investigation, that at least 1/3 of the embryos obtained from miscarriages were malformed and would have developed into monstrosities had they lived to term. Just why these abnormalities occur is not known, nor is there any known method of preventing or correcting them. You might want to keep that story in mind when you read pregnancy advice from then through today. Early prenatal care advocates also bequeathed us the ubiquitous fetal development timeline. And this is the version that was in Van Blarcom's book. As Van Blarcom explained, I have given some space to a description of the course of the baby's development in order that his mother might have an abiding sense of his reality and his need of her protecting care from the very moment of his origin. So as much as this is about teaching women about science and about their bodies, the intent from the beginning of these fetal development timelines was to make the baby real and help the mother love the baby. Over the course of the 20th century, these developmental timelines became even more elegantly aestheticized. And thank you to Professor Holz for this slide and for her wonderful work that you should read. She has written a brilliant article about these sculptures that were created for the 1939 World's Fair. So the Maternity Center Association sponsored an educational display about pregnancy that included these beautiful white plaster sculptures that actually sort of evoke marble, that demonstrate the developmental timeline. Photos of the sculptures, and actually the sculptures themselves, as Professor Holz can tell you about, are held in the collection here on campus. And these photos ended up in widely distributed pamphlets and books about pregnancy. I know I have in my personal collection one that's sponsored by Gerber and is on the back and was widely handed out. And then a little bit later in the century, you may have seen this picture before, Dr. Leonard Nilsson's famous photographs of embryos and fetuses, which were featured in Life magazine in 1965, also became a staple of pregnancy timelines. In all of these timelines, consistent across genres, embryonic and fetal development appear uniform and universal. There is no representation of the many pregnancies that fail to develop in this way. It was not just healthcare providers and public health reformers like Van Blarcom who started paying more attention to pregnant women. Marketers also newly recognized them as valuable customers in the 20th century. As more and more Americans had incomes that made them viable consumers and consumer culture in general flourished, pregnant women became a target of advertising. So this is from an early Sears catalog. I love these maternity dresses because they don't look like they have any baby bump. That was not yet something you could show. But these were maternity dresses, and this is just a sample of pages about maternity and baby clothes and items from an early Sears catalog. Beyond just advertising more things for pregnant women and babies, marketing became more sophisticated around the mid-20th century And marketers began to consider expectant couples to be an especially lucrative audience. This is Ernest Dichter, who's often called the father of market research. And that is a Playtex nurser bottle. In 1964, in Dichter's focus group research on the Playtex nurser, he found that while experienced mothers were skeptical about the sweeping claims Playtex made about its new elaborate nursing system, there are disposable bags inside that you have to, so that you don't have to wash the bottle, but it does create a bit of a project to put it together. Experienced mothers found the bottle harder to assemble than traditional bottles and doubted it could be more convenient. They wondered how a babysitter could handle it and how it would actually work in practice in the middle of the night, for example. They also had a more realistic sense of the intractability of colic, since Playtex was promising that this was going to solve colic. In contrast, women who were pregnant for the first time had no basis for comparison, so they were more inclined to be impressed at how modern and scientific the bottle appeared and to take its complexity for granted. One exclaimed upon opening the box, "Oh, look at all these things. My husband will go crazy putting all of this together. He will have a good time with this." Another mused after putting it together, "The whole thing was not really that bad, and I'm not mechanically minded. As a matter of fact, it was kind of fun. I can just see my husband with it. I bet he will find it fun too." Dichter concluded, "The attitude throughout, as indicated by test results, show inexperienced prospective mothers as a much more positive and accessible market for the nurser than experienced mothers." This is another pattern you may want to look for from here on out in the world of pregnancy care and advertising to pregnant women. I can tell you from experience that I think there are plenty of products on the market today that rely on the same naivete of new moms trying to figure out what things to buy for their baby. So once Dichter and his colleagues had decided that you needed to get women before they actually had the baby, the marketing challenge then was how to find them, how to find women while they were still pregnant. It's a short timeline there. One way was to collect addresses and due dates at the doctor's office, and then so this is from the back of the American Baby magazine. And this was handed out in doctor's offices, and women were invited in doctor's offices to sign up for their free copies. You could get it mailed to you, you could pick it up in the doctor's office, and you could fill out these little coupons and send it to American Baby, and it would send free copies to all your expectant friends. And it gave some pregnancy advice and had fun stories in it, but was primarily an advertising vehicle. Today, the modern version of this is what I showed you up front there, with apps and websites asking you for your due date, collecting your email, and if you're not careful about what you sign up for, selling your email. So marketers actually create and sell first trimester marketing lists. You can go online and just buy one. They're considered very profitable. These marketers begin selling women on the excitement of bonding with an expected baby at a time when many pregnancies will miscarry. Whoop, okay, just leave that. Political changes, too, emerged from and fed into the new ways Americans had learned to think about control over childbearing and the meaning of parenting. As abortion was legalized in 1973, pregnancy became a topic of widespread political and moral debate. Now, this kind of public conversation about pregnancy has some different characteristics than it might have if it weren't actually about abortion and politics rather than about real pregnancies as people are experiencing them. The typical debate over abortion is far removed from any particular real-life pregnancy. In this abstract debate, pregnancies either go to term or are aborted, and miscarriage is invisible. since many people engage with the abortion debates long before they contemplate their own pregnancies, these debates contribute to unrealistic expectations about the certainty of any given pregnancy. And then the terms of the debate are also not attuned to miscarriage. When someone loses a wanted pregnancy, the terminology of pro-life does not feel adequate to the situation. They wanted life, but didn't get it. Neither does pro-choice. They chose a baby and got a miscarriage. Also, pro-life advocacy also often relies on claiming that blastocysts are not only deserving of protection and moral recognition, but that they are already babies. This is a poster from Harvard Right to Life campaign in 2006. It was sort of plastered all over campus and then ended up on the web a few different places. And this is one of the series of posters. Hi, I am Elena, watch me grow. I might just be 30 hours old, but I already have my own 46 of what my doctors call chromosomes, making up my special DNA. Now, if we're talking about 30 hours old, we're talking about probably more than 50% chance that Elena is not going to become a full-term born baby. And in addition to prenatal care and marketers and abortion debates, there were a couple of new medical technologies in the late 20th century that also drew upon and expanded these new cultural expectations around fertility control and emotional bonding as the core of parenting. The technology for obstetric ultrasound was developed in the early 1960s, and by the mid-1980s, a mid-pregnancy ultrasound was a standard part of American prenatal care. And you might take home slides that looked like this. This was the exam that happened around 18 weeks mid-pregnancy when parents looked forward to seeing the baby, and that's often the terms that people use to talk about it. And Americans developed a pretty elaborate ritual that pregnant couples and sonographers understand as an important part of parental bonding. So if you go to have an ultrasound, there's usually a screen for the sonographer as well as a separate screen for the woman and whoever she brings with her to see it. And the sonographer will give a little tour of fetal landmarks. We'll say, oh, here's the head, here's the feet, aren't they cute? You know, here's the little hand, let me show you the heartbeat. And it's considered the emotional part of this exam for many people is as or more important than the part that's a medical exam. Now, more recently, obstetricians have started pretty routinely offering a sonography exam at 8 weeks. Now, at 8 weeks, we're not talking about something where you can see a baby in a clear way in the picture that you get. It's not, the bonding isn't somehow literally about, oh, I see, there's the baby. It's about this ritual that we've developed that's familiar to people, that they go in expecting, oh, here's where we're going to meet the baby. We're going to have the sonogram, we'll have a picture to take home and put on the fridge, and we'll see see what we see, and it's going to be really great. And you can see this in the way people talk about looking forward to their sonogram in pregnancy blogs and vlogs. But of course, at 8 weeks is still a time when it's not that small a chance that the sonographer is going to say, I'm sorry, but I don't see a heartbeat. Or I'm sorry, but what I see is an empty embryonic sac, which is sometimes what you see because the embryo has already died and is not there anymore. What you have is a pregnancy that just hasn't actually finished miscarrying yet. And a second technology has played an important part in how we think about pregnancy and miscarriage. That's the home pregnancy test. They came on the American market in 1978, looking like this, in a package that was essentially a mini home chemistry lab. But by 1988, it became available as something more familiar to us today as the one-step what people call a pee on a stick test. And over time, even these kinds of simpler tests got increasingly sensitive and also much cheaper. The first home pregnancy test you couldn't take until 2 weeks after you had missed a period, which was the same time you might be told like it was reasonable time to go to the doctor and have them take a test. The sensitivity has increased to the point where now you can sometimes get a positive result 5 days before you've missed a period. So you're not waiting. I mean, and they'd love to sell you more tests, so they encourage you to take them as soon as possible. This means that people, if they're using them that way, are not waiting to miss a period, saying, oh, I think I might be pregnant, and then taking a test. They're taking a test because this month we're trying. This month we're not using birth control, we're trying to get pregnant, so I could be, so I'll take a test, and it'll be exciting to find out. That means that you might be taking a test at a point when you have a 30% chance of losing the pregnancy. And yet, these tests can feel like a concrete representation of the baby inside. So check out these family portraits. The first one we probably recognize as a traditional newborn family portrait. My older son's still not really thrilled that this is in the book, but he'll live. The second one is become more of a tradition in recent years. It's a maternity photo shoot where you show the pregnant belly, where you can see the baby, but it's still inside. And now you start to see a pose with a pregnancy test standing in for the baby. It can feel very real, and people build also some rituals around this. They're not as standardized as the ultrasound, but people save the test or share it with their families, their parents, or their partners in special ways, save them, make them into a keepsake. So they become this ritual that we build around taking a test, ends up making it feel like there's really a baby there when there may not be yet. So in conclusion, the past 2.5 centuries have seen deep fundamental cultural shifts in our expectation of control over fertility and our emphasis on the loving parent-child bond as the essence of parenting. These deep cultural shifts have underlaid and been further elaborated by the rise of prenatal care, the development of marketing techniques aimed at expectant parents, the abortion debates, and the rituals we have built around obstetric ultrasound and home pregnancy testing. All of these cultural changes have led us to have unrealistic expectations that pregnancies can be perfect if we do everything right, and to find even early pregnancy losses deeply disturbing, even devastating. Looking at this history, various changes we might want to make to our culture almost suggest themselves. Marketers need to back off, and we need to know as consumers when to say no and not hand over our personal information. Home pregnancy tests could be labeled better to make it clear that they measure HCG. They do not measure the successful establishment of a pregnancy, especially early in pregnancy. Prenatal timelines could be reimagined to give a better sense of the unpredictability of early pregnancy, and so on. There are also two subtler, but in some sense larger changes that I would suggest. The first is, rather than the metaphor of planned parenthood, we could aim for prepared parenthood. We could think of using birth control as a way to postpone our childbearing until we are prepared to be parents. But then knowing that pregnancy doesn't always happen on the timeline that we have planned. So finding ways as a culture, not just individuals changing their expectations, but we know, for example, employers need to give some more flexibility. We can't tell them which month we're going to have the baby, or refuse a promotion because, hey, we might get pregnant we might have a baby. If you are planning for a baby, you could have one in 9 months, or you could have one in 2 years, or maybe even a little longer if there's fertility issues. And all of those are in the range of normal, natural, just how it goes. So if we could aim for prepared parenthood instead of this idea of planned parenthood, it might be a better metaphor for how to think about really how it goes and how much control we have. Second, I would suggest that rather than aiming for bonding, we could think primarily in terms of nurture, especially before birth. So before birth, the bonding could only go one direction anyway. Using this word bonding might be misleading us a little bit about what's going on and about what will work best for us. So we could talk less about feeling the right thing and more about doing the right thing. And this is actually something that I think applies beyond early pregnancy. This might help us also as our children are born and grow. The idea that we don't always have to be bonded with them to do the right thing. Some days you don't feel lovingly bonded with your child, but you can still nurture them. And I think that thinking about our pregnancies that way might actually help us think about our parenting that way. In general, today I have focused on early pregnancy and early pregnancy loss. But as I've suggested, the culture of modern childbearing, our modern expectations of control, of perfection, and of emotional investment does not stop with early pregnancy. Understanding the history surrounding early pregnancy can also give us an informed perspective on childbearing and parenting dilemmas, from struggles with in vitro fetalization to helicopter parenting. And taking note of how intensive attempts to perfect early pregnancy has created a newly devastating experience out of early pregnancy loss may give us some ideas about how we want to shape our future culture so that when it comes to our childbearing, the perfect does not become the enemy of the good. Thank you.
We wanted to do some Q&A. I'm sure you all have some great questions for Lara. But we want to make sure that we get all the questions in the mic because we're recording this. And so if you have a question, raise your hand and I will do my best, Phil Donahue, and run up and down the aisles and put the mic in front of you. So, questions? And,
how might the advancement of the age of like first pregnancy or average age of pregnancy have anything to do with this issue of miscarriage and perfect pregnancies?
Yeah, it does in a couple of ways. So first of all, the chance of miscarriage starts to go up around one's mid-30s. So this situation happens more often and also at a time when fertility is declining. So in fact, something that I think a lot of people don't understand is that our fertility declines first as pregnancies which are not viable before we actually stop ovulating. So there's some years where we have more miscarriages even though we're still able to get pregnant before the years when we really stop ovulating and can't get pregnant. And when women are postponing their childbearing to those years, this is of course a very stressful situation because you're running out of time and yet you're having miscarriages. So I think part of it is everyone needs to know that. Women need to know, men need to know, employers need to know and recognize it. And that we can't really just make this, well, that's women's problem. Clearly we need a culture that understands that it takes a little while to get pregnant and that it can be harder as you get older. And part of my argument in the book, and I'm not able to share every detail with you today, but is that today we've made it so that women are encouraged to attach to and mourn the loss of every pregnancy, whether or not they are young and easily pregnant or older and had trouble getting pregnant. people used to see this as part of a bigger picture. Could you have children? In the end, did you have the children that you wanted to have? And it was, you know, say in the 50s, it was certainly sad if a woman had miscarriages and was not able to have children, but if the end result entailed having some miscarriages on the way to having her children, that was seen as, you know, just part of the journey. And now we've made that sort of not acceptable as part of the journey, even if in the end it's all going to come out with the family that you were hoping to have. And part of what I want to suggest is just, you know, coming back to this awareness that it would be okay if we allowed circumstances to matter. It would be okay if we were very sad about some miscarriages and not about other ones. So this is not to say every miscarriage is no big deal, because some of them are a very big deal, because some of them were a pregnancy that someone struggled for 3 years to get pregnant, or they're 38 and not sure that they're going to be able to get pregnant again. So the other thing is average age of childbearing has gone up, but not so dramatically, but in some ways because it's professional women who are most likely to be postponing their childbearing and also most invested in controlling their pregnancies to the last detail, this situation becomes most acute for those women.
Other questions?
You know, another thing that's really changed over the past 50 years or so is the techniques available to help women become pregnant, not occurring naturally, but they're having trouble conceiving, and so you might want to comment about that.
Absolutely. That's the chapter that didn't fit in the book, but I will write about it. My editor gave me a word count, and the chapter on in vitro fertilization did not make it, but absolutely. So in vitro fertilization is very interesting. It comes partly to this point of older women trying to have children, and you can easily be coming up against a problem of investing time, money, energy, of really, this is the last chance because I can't afford another cycle. So losing a pregnancy in those circumstances can be really, really difficult. Now, what I found so striking when I researched IVF was that given that, why are doctors handing their patients, usually they hand them, something that looks just like one of those printouts from an ultrasound? And they say, here's your embryos. So it's a picture of the fertilized embryos before they've transplanted them back into the woman's uterus. And it looks like, you know, a keepsake. And I, you know, found research that women talked about, like, am I supposed to put this on the fridge? You know, that it feels like it. And women who go through IVF are coming at their pregnancies from the same culture. So also IVF clinics, you know, sort of will do a pregnancy test, and then the nurse will say, congratulations, you're pregnant, without necessarily saying, congratulations, you've made the next hurdle, let's cross our fingers, which to me is the appropriate thing to say to a woman in that, who's in that position. So in this interesting way, IVF should make us, you know, the people who go through IVF certainly know the statistics. They are not naive because they have to go through all of that. They have to agree to pay a lot of money to do it. They know that this is a high-stakes pregnancy. At the same time, they wind up in this same culture. So they wind up being told, congratulations, you're pregnant, based on a home test or on a test from the doctor's office, without the caveats, you know, like, we don't have to call it a baby yet, maybe don't celebrate quite yet, and encouraging them to see this picture, this image, as being like an ultrasound, being like seeing the baby. So I found that it was disappointing to see that we're not necessarily treating women who go through IVF as sensitively as we could be, given the situation that they're in. Thank you.
First off, excuse me. Thank you very much. I'm really interested in the way that you're connecting technology and cultural change. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about a comment you made early on about the 1970s and this transition from seeing a miscarriage as a a lost opportunity to a lost baby. Could you sort of flesh out that change and how that impression changed?
So I gave you one quote that was from 1978 to show you that this was still definitely a change in progress at that time. This was not sort of a sudden change. So in the 60s is when you start to see some support guides for women who miscarry, and those support guides assert that every baby is a lost baby and you should mourn and you have the right to mourn, which you do. I mean, I don't want to reduce or disrespect anyone's grief. That would be a big mistake to make. I just don't want to enforce it on anyone either. So ultrasound became more common in the late 70s, started to be offered to women routinely. By the mid-80s, actually, is when a mid-pregnancy ultrasound became standard in the US. And we don't have fantastic statistics because we don't keep medical statistics in the US, but we have some estimates. So that's, I'd say by about 1985 is when you would expect to have this ritual of seeing the baby. Although I think it's interesting, how does that impact early pregnancy losses? That ultrasound happens at 18 weeks. So it's not necessarily entirely about literally your own ultrasound, helping you feel attached to your baby. But as I was saying, there's this ritual, this expectation, and this distribution of ultrasound images where I think actually part of what happens is people see the distributed images of 18-week ultrasounds. I'm sure this is part of what you're thinking of, right? That then that becomes like, oh, that's what a baby looks like inside. And then they start picturing their own pregnancies from when they have a positive test as being something like what you see on an 18-week ultrasound. And I think that does shift then how people think of what pregnancy is. Although I'm very struck by how somehow having a more realistic idea of what it really looks like. Now you could think that could cut a different way than it has. You could think well, if you saw an 8-week ultrasound and were like, wow, it looks like a circle with a little lump in it. It's not something where you look and you go, oh my goodness, I can see the baby. You have to be told that that's a baby. You would never think it was without somebody coaching you, and yet people go in so ready that they see it as a baby. I mean, sometimes when I give a talk only about the ultrasound, I actually show an episode of Glee. I know it's a little old show now, but there's a very funny episode that involved an ultrasound where the wife is sort of plotting this fake pregnancy, so she goes in and we have the impression that the sonographer who she's paying off is like basically scanning her knees and being like, oh, look, there's the baby. And the husband is like, oh, my baby. And because we know that if it's an ultrasound, it's supposed to be a baby. You don't have to have, it doesn't even have to be of a fetus for people to know that that's what the ritual means and to feel that feeling about it. And I'm not like criticizing people for feeling that. That's how we work. That's how ritual works. But we've made ultrasound we've made a ritual around a technology that's like our cultural rituals of baptism and weddings, where the meaning is not somehow biological or literally the object. It's in the religious or spiritual or cultural ritual we build around it.
I had some questions over here.
Oh, jeez. 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm trying to believe. Do you mind if find someone else now?
Oh, okay. There's somebody else? Okay. Gonna have to pass this down the road here.
Hi, I had a question about how I know you mentioned back then, like many women were happy like after they had their child, and I wanted to know if you did any studies about if postpartum depression was like a big thing back then, like how it is. Well, like now people don't bring it up as much like they do with this. So I wanted to know if you did any studies about it.
So I haven't tried to look at postpartum depression in historical context. I bet there's someone working on it. And if you talk to me later, I'm happy to help you look for that. I would say it's only recently that we've talked about anything, that there was at least something that was called the baby blues. Is that something that you've ever heard? Maybe not, yeah. So there has been, at least since mid-20th century, some recognition that new mothers might not always be happy. But I can see why you're talking about postpartum depression, right? Because the pressure we're talking about when it's all supposed to be perfect and bonded and loving, and you don't feel perfect and bonded and loving, I think part of the reason that we're actually talking about postpartum depression and naming it as a reality now is because the disconnect between this cultural expectation and this cultural pressure and the actual experience of giving birth and being physically exhausted and in pain and having a newborn who stays up all day and all night that you have to take care of and you're trying to learn to nurse and everything else all at the same time is actually a pretty overwhelming experience. And when women saw this as like, this is my lot in life, this is what God wants me to do, they might not be happy. It doesn't mean that they didn't experience negative feelings after birth, but it's different than feeling guilty that you feel sad or exhausted or, in pain after birth, rather than understanding that as maybe part of the process. I think we have a question up here.
I wrote down my question, so it sounds somewhat intelligent. Okay, so I have one child, and before there was an app for that, and after experiencing male factor infertility with my partner, I learned there was certainly very little control over the process that I thought, we had. And so I study rhetoric and media, and so I was thinking about the app that you showed in the beginning just makes pregnancy seem like it's going to be easy and user-friendly and guaranteed, and it encourages this like hyper surveillance of the body and the self. And I think that especially for first-time parents, like fertility is always assumed. Like you don't know that things aren't working correctly until like you find out otherwise. And the market certainly perpetuates this logic also. So I want to ask you, is like through some of your own, like through my own experiences, like, when you go to the doctor, it's always like women are always like seeming to blame too, like for not getting pregnant. Like, oh, it will happen if you just relax or stop drinking caffeine, lose weight, gain weight, stop running, exercise, all these things. So I guess my question is, can you speak at all about whether women blame themselves and to what extent they do when they miscarry? It seems in like some of the earlier work, it was considered just very normal, natural part of the whole, pregnancy journey. But now it seems like, I think in the culture we're living in, like, I think there'd be intense blame and shame on the woman. I don't know if you could speak to that.
So it's a really interesting question, and it's actually, the history is pretty complicated around the blame and shame question, partly because I found contradictory evidence in different time periods. So if you look at medical textbooks from the 18th and 19th century, they do list a million reasons why you miscarried. And if you were reading them through modern eyes, they look like blame. We definitely read them as, you may miscarry if you're too hot, you're too cold, you eat the wrong thing, you jump, you work, you walk in cold water, and the list goes on. And right now, we would read that, our app would be like, here's the list of things you shouldn't do, and if you do them, it's probably your fault if you miscarry. But on the other hand, it's not totally clear that the doctors who were writing that thing meant that literally as a prescription of what women shouldn't do. And my colleague Shannon Withacombe, who's written this wonderful book on miscarriage in 19th-century America, found that when she looked at how women talked about their miscarriages, that they actually didn't talk about blaming themselves. That there seemed to be this sense of like diagnosis, kind of like, or telling the doctor, I think it must have been because of that thunderstorm. So getting frightened with something, shock could cause a miscarriage in that long list of things that was supposed to cause a miscarriage. Or I think it was because I fell, or I think it was because, but it was not clear that meant that women were blaming themselves. On the other hand, there's some evidence from Europe. Now, of course, that evidence always is from these wealthy gentry women, aristocrats who are in Europe, who were usually married young, and like literally their job is to create male heirs, and where they did seem to reflect some feelings of guilt over miscarrying. So it's a little, like that picture is a little hard to clarify. My sense also, like when people have given me their own anecdotes, my sense is that sense of guilt and shame over it, like I must have done it, is actually more of a 20th century phenomenon. I mean, so interestingly, because of the 19th century story that, like, well, a lot of women were actually welcoming miscarriages. 19th century doctors, you see them who didn't like that women were, in their eyes, causing their own abortions, causing miscarriages on purpose, would yell about how women were so careless and careless on purpose, and women tell each other it's not too hard to get rid of a pregnancy, just jump around enough, or and gave each other these prescriptions for causing pregnancy loss. You can see how that when you then come into a time period where people are not hoping for some early losses, that could turn into feeling like, oh, maybe if those things do cause it, then actually I'm supposed to not do them, or else then I'm to blame when it happens. Because when I speak to people, I get a lot of stories, anecdotal stories from women who are now in their 60s and 70s, 80s, who talk about feeling like it was their fault, like they were blamed for miscarrying. So that certainly can be part of the story. So I think now, on one side, it does feel like these apps, they tell you like 10 million things that you shouldn't do. They're a little more informed than they were in the 19th century, but still, we can look at the list and say, yeah, well, that's still not going to prevent at least 2/3 of the miscarriages, probably more. So if you miscarry, probably it's a chromosomal abnormality. It's probably not the sushi or the sauna or whatever it is that you think you did wrong. On the other hand, at least the medical world is doing a much better job of telling women that than they were when Van Blarcom was giving her advice in 1922. So I have not seen like great sociological or psychological research as to how many women blame themselves anyway, and when exactly in their pregnancies they get the information that, look, I know you wanted to make it all work out, but it's not your fault. But usually at least it's there somewhere in a way that it wasn't, as recently as the 1960s.
This may seem a bit controversial of a question, but I understand that America has had a declining religious standpoint, and I wonder how much the decline of religion has affected our view of miscarriages and that type of stuff, if there has been a more scientific point of view towards it now.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that question. And hey, if I do the history of sexuality and reproduction, controversy is kind of inevitable. And part of the reason to do it, really, right, is to have a way to talk about difficult moral, religious, ethical questions with some information and perspective. So yes, religion matters and the secularization of America matters, though I think perhaps in a different way than you're thinking, and actually in a different way than I see it get narrated in a lot of the, especially the Catholic pro-life version of history, which I love that they want to do history, but it makes me crazy when they don't use the facts. So what I would say is the secularization is a really, really big part of the story of how we became less fatalistic. So becoming more secular goes along with the scientific revolution. And they're together. It's not like one caused the other, but this entire transition from thinking that what you want to study is what you inherited. And that's what scholarship meant in the medieval period. That it was about received wisdom, whether it was religious or secular. And the scientific revolution began to think that actually knowledge was not about received wisdom, but was about creating new knowledge. And it's a really different idea about what it means to know things and learn things. So in that entire transition, and then America did become, and the world became more secular during the course of the 19th century, partly in response to all of this interest in science and the idea that what you know about the world could grow and change, but then they feed each other. So I think it's not, I know that the Catholic Church tries to write this history that we used to have all this respect for embryos and fetuses and now we don't, and then we legalized abortion. But actually, so abortion wasn't made illegal until after women started to reduce their childbearing fairly dramatically. There was a lot of concern that women were not having enough children. And then actually it was physicians at the time who didn't like that women were taking it into their own hands and that they were often approaching, the person in that ad was probably an eclectic physician, it was called. In other words, not a mainstream physician. They didn't like people who they considered quacks were offering medical services and said, no, women need to come to us. We get to decide when an abortion is legitimate and when it's not. There's always had been somewhat of an attitude traditionally that abortion was justified in some circumstances when a woman was having health issues, when there was some question whether she could have a safe pregnancy, and maybe if she was not married, that it was already a bad situation, but why make it worse by having the child? And not legitimate in other situations. A married woman who was healthy, who was having a child, was seen as like rejecting her role to be going and having an abortion and not something she ought to be doing. And so there was in some ways more flexibility, in fact, about how how Americans in general understood the role of abortion. And basically, if a woman was in good faith trying to have and grow a family and care for a family, she was doing what her social role was, and that was seen as positive and good. And if once in a while someone needed an abortion in order to maintain her health, as long as she was discreet about it, yeah, that happens, that was part of the story. When women started to more like take it into their own hands and say, no, actually, we only want like 2 children, 3 maybe, and a different kind of life, that's when there was a real backlash to these abortion providers, and especially how public they were about it, that there wasn't any sense of discretion, to advertise it in the newspaper. So it was actually sort of more of a cultural shift that was about women's roles, that was not about refusing this kind of fatalism and thinking that you could take control, was actually more objectionable, sort of like religiously objectionable, than the idea that it was just definitely a problem to disrupt a pregnancy. So, so the role of religious change has gone hand in hand with this idea. It's not just about God's will, but about fate and how much you have a fatalistic approach to life. And so, I don't know, I think that I hope that gets at some of what you're thinking of. It is the change in how people think about religion in their lives matters, but it's not in this direct way, this history that we imagine where somehow people used to be religious, they'd never have an abortion. Now people are not so religious, so they have abortions. Because that's not really how the story went. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Hi. So it kind of seems that historically and contemporarily pregnancies are kind of celebrated, but considering that menstruation is correlated to conceiving and that menstruation is highly stigmatized, can you describe where the shift between the views on the menstrual cycle and pregnancy occurs?
Well, I do love to talk about menstruation too. My first book was called The Modern Period, Menstruation in 20th-Century America. So I will say that interestingly, they're considered like almost totally separate, I would say, today. That ovulation and ovulatory cycle to most women has almost nothing to do with a cycle of bleeding. That a lot of women are using birth control that prevents menstruation, and assume that when they want to get pregnant, they will stop that birth control. They might have to cope with a few periods, and then they'll get pregnant. Then they can go back on the birth control that prevents menstruation afterwards. And they're right, they can do that. So, I mean, I think it's that I think where your question possibly might be coming from is that there was a critique of the way we came to think about menstruation in the 20th century, which I called the modern period, which was all about controlling your periods, making them obey your will, and at least keeping them under control for your own personal purposes, kind of minimizing. What could you do to minimize the impact of menstruation in your life so you could go on doing things the normal way? You could feel as you did all month, pursue your activities as you would all month, do everything kind of the way you normally would. And so I think, so part of it's the story of that actually that kind of control over menstruation is perfectly consistent with this kind of control over childbearing. There was a critique starting in the 70s of this idea of it's really feminist to have good control over your periods and not have to have a period if you didn't want it. And actually maybe we should celebrate menstruation and think of it as fertility and representing our ability to have children. And that if menstruation is part of our fertility cycle, shouldn't it be a positive thing? And some of the pamphlets taught it that way. That never became a mainstream view, even though it was a robust critique of the way we began to think about menstruation in the 20th century. I think what we have worked out today culturally is actually this kind of, it's all about control. Before I want to get pregnant, I control my period to have it if I want it and not have it if I don't want it. And then when I want to get pregnant, I switch the controls by going off the birth control and, planning my cycles. Maybe I use an ovulation test. I don't know if you know about those, but you can use these pee on a stick tests that'll tell you whether you're ovulating that day and whether it's a good time to get pregnant or not. And then maybe you can get pregnant, that month or the next month. You don't have to waste any time with these menstrual cycles that represent your fertility. So I think actually the logic is consistent, even though in the terms of the 70s feminist critics, it shouldn't be.
I'm going to stop there. Oh, we have one. Okay, this is really the last question because I know they want us to be out of the building. So you get the final word.
How much do you see this particular issue as being sort of localized to America? Maybe perhaps because of our the way that consumerism plays into social roles, but maybe even maybe due to like the abortion debate and how much that's present in our lives. I mean, if you drive around in any small town in Nebraska, I can guarantee you can find a sign that has a picture of an infant that's probably 6 months old saying, I'm a life too, and maybe just putting that imagery on what a pregnancy is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, yeah. So, to some degree, this is an American story. And I've told it as such partly because there's a limit to how much research I can do and how much I want to try to say about the whole world, because I won't be able to get all of it right and have the details correct. It's a combination. So it's not just the United States, for sure. So I have to say I've seen this reaction to miscarriage for sure in other Anglo settings, so coming out of the UK and also Australia, when you search up pregnancy in these websites. But it can be a little hard to tell if I don't think it's as if it arose sort of piecemeal in different places and all happens to look the same. Babycenter.com, the internet is global. And they have there's a UK version and an American version that are slightly different, where center is spelled differently in the UK, but they're basically the same information, and people are sharing across these boundaries really pretty profoundly in the last couple decades. So I do think the details are different in different places. As you're pointing out, abortion debates are far more prominent here and have a different meaning in the US than they do in many other places. So they play a bigger part in the story. But interestingly, this feeling about the loving bond and about having control is common, even if it takes slightly different form across, for sure, the English-speaking world. And I've seen some evidence from like Germany and France, but once you get away from English speaking, you at least see some differences. So like I've seen anecdotally Americans comment on if they were pregnant in Germany, going to a German obstetrician, the joke is that they're German, so they're very dour, and having the obstetrician say, kind of like, well, yes, you're pregnant, but don't celebrate yet. And they're not wrong, and the American response to this is, how can you be so negative? You should be optimistic. We're optimistic Americans. But the German, what the German doctor is saying is actually true, and maybe they're saying it somewhat in reaction to what they see as the over-optimistic Americans who believe you can make everything work if you try hard enough. So I think there are things about our American culture that for sure amplify this for us, but that I would love to see somebody, take this and really do this project in England and in Australia and compare notes and see how much of it crosses and how much of it is distinctively American. But we're surely not in this alone at this point.
Well, I'm going to stop us there. I want to thank you so much for a really great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.